Somewhere beneath the wheat fields of Henan province, in soil that has not seen daylight in 9,000 years, a team of scientists knelt beside a grave and did something no historian, no emperor, and no ancient chronicler could ever do. They did not read a scroll. They did not study a painted vase. They opened a tiny fragment of bone, extracted a few strands of degraded genetic material, and asked the dead a question directly: where do you come from, and who were your people? What they found did not fit neatly into the story most of us grew up with. There is no single ancient foreign civilization hiding inside Chinese DNA, waiting to be discovered like a secret code. The real story is stranger and, honestly, more remarkable than that. It is a story of two separate populations, born thousands of kilometers apart, who spent millennia slowly moving toward each other, mixing, splitting again, and mixing once more, until their combined genetic inheritance became the foundation of one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth. This is the actual science, pulled from peer-reviewed genome studies published in the last few years, and it is worth telling properly, because the truth turns out to be far more interesting than any clickbait headline could capture. To understand where this story begins, you have to go back roughly 60,000 years, to a time when a small population of modern humans first pushed out of Africa and began spreading across Eurasia. Over tens of thousands of years, these early wanderers split into countless smaller groups, each finding its own path across mountains, rivers, and coastlines. Some pushed north into Siberia. Some followed coastlines eastward into Southeast Asia. Some settled along great river systems and began, for the first time in human history, to plant seeds instead of only chasing herds. By the time we reached 9 or 10,000 years ago, deep in what is now China, two very different populations had already taken shape, and their differences would end up defining Chinese ancestry for the next 10,000 years. The first population lived along the Yellow River in the north. This was a harsh, dry landscape of loose soil and cold winters, and the people who lived there built their lives around a small, tough grain called millet. Archaeologists sometimes call this the cradle of northern Chinese civilization, because it was here, along the Yellow River, that some of the earliest organized farming communities in East Asia took root. Genetically, this population has come to be known as Northern East Asian ancestry, and when scientists compare it to people living in East Asia today, it turns out to be remarkably close to the DNA of most modern East Asians, including the majority of Han Chinese. The second population lived far to the south, along the warmer, wetter banks of the Yangtze River and down along the southern coastline. Life here revolved not around millet, but around rice, cultivated in flooded paddies, in a climate that made agriculture possible almost year-round. This population carried what researchers call Southern East Asian ancestry, and it turns out to be genetically distinct from its northern counterpart in ways that are still detectable in ancient bones today. When scientists sequenced the genome of an individual who lived roughly 8,400 years ago at a site called Qihei in modern Fujian province, they found that this southern lineage was not just a local curiosity. It represented the deep ancestral roots of a much larger group of people, the Austronesian-speaking populations, who would later spread across Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and eventually out into the vast expanse of the Pacific, as far as Hawaii, New Zealand, and Madagascar. In other words, some of the greatest ocean-crossing voyagers in human history traced their genetic origins back to the rice farmers of southern China. This is where the story starts to get genuinely surprising. When researchers first began comparing the archaeology of these two regions, the tools people used, the shapes of their pottery, the way their societies appeared to be organized, they expected the genetics to follow the same script. Different tools, different farming methods, different pottery styles. Surely that meant different, unrelated peoples. But ancient DNA does not always agree with pottery. In several cases, scientists found that even as farming techniques and artistic styles evolved dramatically over centuries, the underlying genetic makeup of a community barely shifted at all. Cultural change, it turns out, does not always require new people moving in. Sometimes ideas simply travel, carried by trade, by marriage between neighboring villages, by word of mouth passed from one generation to the next, without any large-scale migration behind them at all. This insight became especially clear in one of the most detailed ancient DNA studies on China to date, published in 2025 by a team from Peking University, working alongside researchers from Yunnan University and Minzu University of China. The team focused on a site called Baligang, located in Henan province, sitting almost exactly at the crossroads between the northern millet farming world and the southern rice farming world. If you wanted to find a place where these two ancient populations might meet, mix, and leave behind a genetic record of that encounter, Baligang would be exactly the place to look. And that is precisely what the researchers found. Working with the complete genomes of 58 ancient individuals, spanning an enormous stretch of time from the Middle Neolithic period all the way through the Late Bronze Age, the scientists discovered that the earliest residents of Balagang were already a genetic mixture of northern and southern ancestry. This mixing was not a later development. It was already baked into the population from the very beginning of the settlement's history, meaning the blending of these two great lineages of East Asia had started earlier than many researchers had assumed. What happened next inside this community is where the science becomes almost novelistic. As centuries passed and the site moved through different archaeological phases, known to specialists as the Kujialing period and later the Longshan period, the tools, the pottery, and the visible material culture of the site changed substantially. A casual observer looking only at the artifacts might assume an entirely new group of people had arrived and displaced the old one. But when the Izayu researchers looked at the actual genetic composition of the population buried in the ground, they found something quietly astonishing. The DNA remained largely stable. The people were, in a very real biological sense, the same lineage continuing forward through time, even as the visible surface of their culture transformed around them. It is a powerful reminder that a civilization's material record and its biological record do not always tell the same story, and that assuming migration every time you see a change in artifacts can lead you to the wrong conclusion entirely. But Balagang held one more secret, and this one had nothing to do with North and South at all. It had to do with family structure, and it came from a single extraordinary burial, inside what archaeologists label the M13 collective burial. Excavators found the remains of more than 90 individuals buried together, an unusually large communal grave for this period. The research team managed to extract usable genetic material from 75 of them, and when they analyzed the Y chromosomes of the males in that burial, meaning the genetic material passed exclusively from father to son, they discovered that every single one of them shared the exact same paternal lineage. Every male in that grave descended, ultimately, from one shared paternal ancestor. Now compare that to the female side of the same burial. When the researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of the women, meaning the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child, they found something completely different. A wide diversity of maternal lineages, no shared common ancestor, women who had clearly come from many different family backgrounds. Put those two findings side by side and you get a genetic fingerprint of an entire social system. The men in this community were staying put, generation after generation, all descending from the same paternal line, buried together in death as they presumably lived together in life. The women, on the other hand, were marrying in from elsewhere, bringing their own distinct ancestries into the community from outside. This is what anthropologists call a patrilineal and patrilocal society, where descent is traced through the father's line and women move to join their husband's family and community after marriage. What makes the Balagang discovery so significant is that it represents the first direct genetic proof of this kind of social organization in Neolithic China, pushing the documented origins of patrilineal family. Structure in the region back by thousands of years earlier than historians had previously been able to confirm using written records or archaeology alone. Before this, scholars had to infer family structures from grave goods, burial orientation, and later historical texts. Now, for the first time, the biology itself is speaking. This single discovery matters far beyond one archaeological site, because patrilineal, patrilocal social structures went on to become a defining feature of Chinese society for thousands of years afterward, echoed later in the clan systems, ancestral naming traditions, and family registration practices that shaped dynastic China. Finding direct genetic evidence of this pattern already firmly in place during the Neolithic period tells us that some of the deepest social structures of Chinese civilization were not a later invention of philosophers or emperors. They were already present, quietly encoded in family burial practices, thousands of years before anyone wrote the first character of classical Chinese script. Of course, Baligang is only one site, sitting at one particular crossroads in Chinese prehistory. To understand the fuller picture, researchers have had to piece together evidence from dozens of locations spread across an enormous and geographically diverse country, and every new excavation adds another thread to the tapestry. Consider, for example, a very different region entirely, the Ganking area of northwestern China, home in ancient times to a group known as the Diqiang people. Researchers analyzing remains from a site called Mogu, dated to roughly 4,000 years ago, wanted to answer a specific and long debated question. Was there ever real genetic contact between these early Diqiang communities and the ancestors of the Han Chinese population that would later dominate the Central Plains? For years, some scholars had proposed a connection, but the actual biological evidence to support it was missing. The genetic data settled the question. Mogu individuals showed remarkable diversity in their maternal lineages, 14 separate mitochondrial haplogroups identified in total, suggesting a community that drew women in from many different surrounding populations. Yet, on the paternal side, the picture again showed much tighter consistency, with the men overwhelmingly belonging to a single Y chromosome lineage. When researchers compared this population to 7 other ancient groups and 38 modern Chinese populations, encompassing nearly 1,800 individuals in total, they found that Mogu shared close genetic ties with later Diqiang descendants, and with an early Han-related population from a site called Hengbai. Statistical modeling estimated that somewhere between 13 and 18% admixture occurred between the Mogu population and northern Han ancestors roughly 3,300 to 3,800 years ago. Even more strikingly, up to a third of the paternal lineages and as much as 70% of the maternal lineages found in the ancient Mogu population can still be detected in present-day northern Han Chinese populations today. That is not a symbolic connection. That is a measurable, traceable genetic thread stretching across 4,000 years, still present in the DNA of tens of millions of living people. This is, in many ways, the real answer to the question the misleading headline was trying to ask. There is no single ancient civilization somewhere in the world whose DNA uniquely matches modern Chinese populations, as though ancestry worked like a fingerprint match in a crime drama. What the genetic evidence actually shows is layer upon layer of internal connection. Northern millet farmers mixing with southern rice farmers, western steppe-adjacent populations mixing with central agricultural communities, regional groups exchanging people, especially women, across marriage networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, all of it happening again and again over a span of 9,000 years or more. Modern Chinese ancestry is not a single thread traced back to one distant match. It is a woven fabric built from many different regional populations that gradually grew closer together, biologically and culturally, over an extraordinarily long stretch of time. This pattern becomes even clearer when you zoom out to look at the broader genetic history of East Asia as a whole, rather than any single site. Large-scale studies sequencing dozens of ancient individuals from across northern and southern China, spanning from roughly 9,500 years ago down to just a few hundred years ago, have consistently found the same fundamental split. A northern lineage most closely related to present-day East Asians in general, and a southern lineage most closely related to present-day Southeast Asians, and, again, to Austronesian-speaking populations scattered across the islands of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Over the course of the Neolithic period, these studies show a clear southward movement of northern-related ancestry, mixing with southern populations as farming communities expanded, trade networks grew denser, and people moved in search of better land, better opportunities, or simply to join family through marriage. This slow, repeated mixing across thousands of years, not a single dramatic encounter with any outside civilization, is what ultimately produced the genetic landscape of modern East Asia. There is something almost poetic about how this unfolds when you trace it carefully. Researchers working directly with ancient bone and tooth samples have described their own surprise at just how early this diversity appears in the archaeological record. When one geneticist analyzed the DNA of people who lived along the southern coast of China more than 8,000 years ago, the expectation going in was that this population might trace back to some entirely separate, perhaps more archaic lineage, distinct from the well-studied northern farming groups. Some researchers wondered if these coastal people might be more closely related to earlier, older populations of East Asia, distant relatives of ancient individuals like the so-called Tianyuan man, one of the oldest sequenced modern human genomes in the region, dating back over 39,000 years, or perhaps related to hunter-gatherer populations found today in parts of mainland Southeast Asia. Instead, when the actual DNA was compared, every single sampled individual turned out to be closely related to present-day East Asians. The deep roots of southern Chinese ancestry, and by extension the deep roots of the Austronesian expansion across the Pacific, were already firmly East Asian in character by that point, not the remnant of some separate older lineage waiting to be uncovered. So if there is a genuine, scientifically supported version of the idea that inspired that dramatic headline, it is this. The closest genetic relatives of modern Chinese populations are not found in some distant, unconnected ancient civilization on the other side of the world. They are found right there in China itself, in the bones of Yellow River, millet farmers and Yangtze rice farmers who lived, worked, married, and were buried in the very same landscapes their descendants occupy today. The real match was never something waiting to be discovered abroad. It was internal, regional, and continuous, an unbroken thread of biological connection, running from the earliest Neolithic farming villages straight through to the present day. This continuity is precisely what makes Chinese civilization such a compelling case study for geneticists and archaeologists working together. In most parts of the world, large-scale migrations, invasions, and population replacements have repeatedly overwritten the genetic record, making it difficult to trace unbroken lines of ancestry across many thousands of years. China offers something rarer, a place where, despite dynastic upheavals, wars, and enormous cultural transformation on the surface, the underlying biological population has remained remarkably stable and traceable across an extraordinary span of time. That stability is not a sign that nothing happened, quite the opposite. It is a sign that change in China so often happened through internal blending, absorption, and gradual mixing, rather than wholesale replacement of one population by another. It helps to understand just how young this entire field of research actually is. The ability to sequence ancient human genomes with real reliability only became possible in the last 15 to 20 years, as sequencing technology grew dramatically cheaper and more precise, and as laboratories developed cleaner methods for handling fragile, degraded samples without contaminating them with modern human DNA. Before that, the study of ancient migrations relied almost entirely on archaeology, on comparing the shapes of tools and the styles of pottery, on linguistics, and on the genetics of living populations used to infer indirectly what might have happened in the deep past. Ancient DNA changed all of that. For the first time, scientists could examine the actual genetic material of a person who lived 9,000 years ago and compare it directly to a person who lived 4,000 years ago and to a person alive today without having to guess. China, given both its enormous population history and its long, well-preserved archaeological record, quickly became one of the most important regions in the world for this kind of work. And Chinese research institutions, particularly the Institute of Vertebrate Paleontology and Paleoanthropology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and later Peking University's Biomedical Pioneering Innovation Center, have become global leaders in generating and interpreting this data. It is also worth sitting for a moment with what rice and millet actually meant for these two ancestral populations, because the crops themselves help explain why the northern and southern lineages developed so differently in the first place, and why it took so long for them to fully merge. Millet is a hardy, drought-resistant grain, well suited to the drier, colder climate of the Yellow River Basin, and it allowed northern communities to establish stable, semi-permanent settlements, even in a relatively harsh environment. Rice, by contrast, thrives in warm, wet, low-lying land, and its cultivation in the Yangtze Basin encouraged a very different kind of settlement pattern, often built around river deltas, wetlands, and coastal plains. These two agricultural traditions did not simply produce different diets. They produced different economies, different settlement densities, different social structures, and, over enough generations, different genetic profiles shaped in part by which populations tended to marry within their own farming communities, and which populations moved and mixed more freely with their neighbors. When northern and southern ancestries finally did begin to blend in a serious way, starting well before the era captured at Baligang and continuing for thousands of years afterward, they were not simply merging two similar groups of people. They were merging two entirely different ways of living off the land, and the resulting civilization inherited elements of both. This is also where the Austronesian story becomes especially worth lingering on, because it shows just how far the influence of southern Chinese ancestry eventually traveled. The rice farming populations of the southern Chinese coast did not stay put. Over the course of several thousand years, their descendants, or at least populations closely related to them, began moving out across the Ewater, first to Taiwan, then gradually further out into the islands of Southeast Asia, and eventually across almost the entire span of the Pacific Ocean, reaching as far as Hawaii to the north, Easter Island to the east, and Madagascar off the coast of Africa to the west. This makes the Austronesian expansion one of the most geographically vast migrations in all of human history, and its genetic starting point traces back, at least in significant part, to the same ancient population whose remains were found along the southern Chinese coastline more than 8,000 years ago. In other words, the ancestors of some of the greatest long-distance ocean navigators the world has ever known were, genetically speaking, close cousins of the earliest rice farmers of southern China. That connection alone should put to rest any notion that the story of Chinese ancestry is a closed, isolated one. If anything, the genetic evidence shows populations connected to ancient China spreading outward across enormous distances, rather than a single foreign population somehow matching inward. None of this diminishes the achievements or the depth of Chinese civilization. If anything, it makes the story more impressive because it shows a civilization built not on isolation, but on connection. The people of the Yellow River and the people of the Yangtze were, genetically speaking, distinct populations for thousands of years before they began to merge. Their eventual blending was not the erasure of one group by another, but a genuine synthesis, a coming together of two different agricultural traditions, two different environmental adaptations, and two different sets of ancestors, into something new that neither group had been on its own. The Baligang site captures that synthesis in astonishing detail, showing northern and southern ancestry already mingling in a single community as early as the Middle Neolithic period, thousands of years before anything resembling a unified Chinese state existed. It is also worth pausing on just how difficult this kind of research actually is, because it helps explain why definitive answers have taken so long to emerge. and why sweeping, simplified claims about ancient DNA should always be treated with some healthy skepticism. Extracting usable genetic material from bones that are thousands of years old is an enormously delicate process. DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller and smaller fragments, and it becomes contaminated by soil bacteria, by handling during excavation, and by the DNA of anyone who has touched the remains since they were unearthed. Certain skeletal elements preserve DNA far better than others. The dense petrous portion of the skull, located near the inner ear, has become a favorite target for researchers precisely because its density helps protect genetic material from breaking down. Even with the best preserved samples, sequencing an ancient genome and confidently comparing it to hundreds or thousands of other ancient and modern genomes requires enormous computational effort and rigorous statistical modeling. This is not the kind of research where a scientist glances at a spreadsheet and instantly declares a match. It involves years of laboratory work, cross-referencing against enormous genetic databases, and careful peer review before any conclusion is published, and even then, conclusions are usually stated with careful qualification rather than dramatic certainty. This is also worth keeping in mind whenever ancient DNA research gets picked up by popular media and turned into a headline. Genuine scientific papers describing this kind of work are usually written in careful, hedged statistical language, full of phrases like consistent with, estimated admixture proportions, and supported by modeling. Because that is what honest science actually sounds like when it is dealing with fragmentary evidence pulled from bones thousands of years old. Somewhere between the laboratory and the headline, the careful language often gets stripped away and replaced with something far more dramatic and far more definitive than the underlying data can actually support. A study describing a plausible degree of genetic continuity between two regional populations becomes, in a video title, a sweeping claim about an entire civilization being matched to something else entirely. That is worth remembering the next time you come across a headline promising a single, tidy genetic answer to a question as complex as the origins of an entire civilization. Real population genetics rarely produces one. Clean, singular match. It produces branching trees, overlapping ancestries, gradients of relatedness that shift gradually across geography, and populations that blend into their neighbors more often than they mysteriously connect to civilizations on the opposite side of the planet. The scientists who spend their careers doing this work are not looking for a single dramatic reveal. They are patiently reconstructing a mosaic, one ancient genome at a time, and the picture that mosaic reveals is one of gradual, repeated, deeply human connection. Farmers moving to new land, families sending daughters to marry into neighboring villages, communities absorbing new ideas and occasionally new people without losing their underlying biological continuity. When you step back and look at the full sweep of this research, from the earliest sequenced ancient genomes in East Asia, to the detailed split between northern millet farmers and southern rice farmers, to the discovery of deep patrilineal social structures at Baligang, to the traceable 4,000-year-old genetic threads connecting the Dai Qiang people of the Northwest to modern Han Chinese populations, a clear and consistent picture emerges. Chinese ancestry was never waiting on a single external match to explain it. It was built, layer by layer, region by region, marriage by marriage, over roughly 10,000 years of continuous human history, almost entirely from within. That, ultimately, is a far more remarkable discovery than any single dramatic headline could capture. It tells us that one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth was not the product of one migration, one moment, or one match. It was the product of diversity meeting diversity, again and again, until unity itself became the inheritance. And there is likely much more still to come. Every year, new sites are excavated, new labs come online, and new statistical methods make it possible to squeeze reliable data out of samples that would have been considered too degraded to analyze even a decade ago. Regions of China that remain relatively understudied in ancient DNA terms, including large stretches of the southwest and the far northeast, are only beginning to be explored in this kind of detail, and each new genome sequenced from those regions has the potential to add another thread to the picture, or to complicate it in ways researchers do not yet anticipate. That is the nature of honest science. It does not promise a single final answer wrapped up neatly for a headline. It promises a slowly sharpening picture, revised again and again as new evidence arrives, always a little more accurate than the picture that came before it. So the next time you see a headline claiming that scientists have found the one ancient civilization that matches a modern population's DNA, treat it the way you would treat any claim that sounds too clean to be true. Ask where the actual study is. Ask which journal published it. Ask what the researchers themselves actually said in their own careful words, rather than what a video title decided to say on their behalf. Because the real story, or the one written in peer-reviewed pages rather than clickbait thumbnails, is almost always more layered, more human, and ultimately more satisfying than the simplified version ever could be. And it is a story still being written today, one ancient bone fragment, one sequenced genome, and one careful peer-reviewed study at a time, by scientists patiently listening to what the dead have to say about where we all came from.